Are you ready to push past your limits and conquer your next running goal? In this training, we'll reveal the secrets to unlocking your mental toughness, transforming every step into a victory. Whether you're a seasoned runner or just starting out and ready to discover the mindset that will take you from struggling to thriving on the roads. Welcome to episode 262 on the Healthy Runner podcast, where we help you get stronger, run faster, and enjoy lifelong injury-free running. Today, I am excited to have the one, the only Coach Jason Fitzgerald from the Strength Running website, podcast, and YouTube channel back on the show. How you doing today, Jason?
I'm great, Duane. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, thank you for coming back on the show. And for those that want to get a more deep dive of Jason's background, I will direct you to episode 20 on the Healthy Runner podcast, which is all the way back in, believe it or not, Jason, June of 2020. So this is like in the middle of the pandemic, where we talked about injury prevention from a coach's perspective. And then also episode 171, which was in 2023, where we chatted about strength training as power training. In this episode, Jason is going to really fill your mindset bucket from our Spark Healthy Runner 6-step plan to growing as a runner. Remember, mindset is equally as important as the running, the strength training, the nutrition, the recovery, and the race strategy. And that is why I am so excited about this particular topic, because I feel like almost every runner can improve upon in this area, no matter what their journey looks like and where they are in their journey. So I want to get right into this, Jason. What does mental toughness mean to you?
Great question. I think it's a great question because it honestly is a little bit hard to define. And if you ask 10 coaches what mental toughness means, you're probably going to get 10 different answers. And that's true for sports psychologists as well. It's a very nebulous term. But for me, I define it as a skill that allows runners to stay positive and solve problems while training and running at a peak level and just without succumbing to any of those feelings of fear, discomfort, humiliation, failure, etc. So it's very much a problem solving skill that helps you stay positive in light of adversity. And so that's a huge umbrella term, and we can put examples of mental toughness, and we could probably talk through dozens and dozens of examples of mental toughness. I think a lot of runners think about, well, I want to be mentally tough in the final mile of a 5K. That's a very classic example where you're experiencing a lot of discomfort and you have to solve the problem of either maintaining or increasing your pace while under high degrees of physical stress. And let's be honest, mental stress too. But then there's also mental toughness that's like, can I be consistent with the injury treatment protocol devised by my physical therapist? Because let's be honest, I don't want to treat my injury. I want to train for my race. I'm a runner. I love to train. I don't want to spend 45 minutes a day doing, these PT exercises and all these movements and recovery modalities. That's just not fun for me. Well, a mentally tough runner will stay consistent. They'll recognize the value of that work, and they'll recognize that it's in the service of their long-term bigger goals, which might be run their first marathon, run a certain time in a race, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of different examples of mental toughness, but at the end of the day, it's a skill. So that means you can learn it, you can build it, it can grow over time, and it ultimately allows you to positively solve all kinds of different problems in your running career without overthinking it and succumbing to those negative emotions.
Wow, I love your kind of definition or explanation of it, and it isn't just what I didn't hear is just like pushing harder or running faster or turning off your mind and just letting your body push through limits.
Well, it's
And
not willpower for sure.
yeah,
I think a
Yeah.
lot of runners want to define mental toughness as trying harder, as willpower, as, I'm never going to give up, no pain, no gain. There's all kinds of ways that we can sort of dance around this, but that's all to me fake toughness, because there are times where you want to drop out of a race. There are times where you don't want to finish a workout. And the runner who is not mentally tough will see that as only weakness. Whereas the mentally tough runner might actually realize that there are real world issues that are affecting their performance. And it's a good thing for them to drop out of a workout or a race, or maybe to cut a long run short, whatever it might be. And so you have to have that positive skill of problem solving that's going to help your ultimate goal, even if the short term expression of that problem solving looks like quitting.
Man, I love that. And I think back to my coach actually had me read Steve Magnus's book, Do Hard Things. And a lot of what you're mentioning is kind of his thoughts on like doing hard things and what that entails. And I love that it's a problem solving skill, as you mentioned, because that tells me if it's a skill, then we can train it, which is awesome. And for those that are like all about lifelong learning, like I am, I feel like this is a skill I want to improve personally in my running journey. But I think a lot of runners listening to this right now are going to be able to benefit from that. So, in your experience, when does a lack of this skill or mental toughness or coping mechanisms show up the most in runners?
Yeah, there's a lot of different instances in which you can see a lack of mental toughness. And again, probably, the example that a lot of runners are thinking about is the times during workouts or races where they settle and they don't give it their best. And, of course, that's a good example of mental toughness, but it's really just scratching the surface. Um, I think a great example of mental toughness is being process oriented and really focusing on the step by step process of training, not cutting any corners, doing what you're supposed to do, but also allowing some flexibility for creativity, for inspiration, and also flexibility to, like I mentioned before, cut a workout short, cut a long run short. And so part of being committed to process oriented training is understanding how things should be done, really committing yourself to that process, but also recognizing when you shouldn't do something and when that's okay. I think a great example of mental toughness is in the injury treatment phase of training, where it's not classic training. You're not doing the training that you actually want to do, but you might be doing more cross training. You might be doing more strength training. You might find yourself in Duane's office, God forbid. And those are the things you don't really want to do. Let's be honest. I once spent 2 weeks in the pool running, going to the trainer and getting treated. And I didn't want to do any of that. And it was really hard to do 90 minutes of pool running every day. But that's an example of mental toughness. I think a often ignored example of mental toughness is the idea of training progression. That when you first start running, you might be running 20 or 30 miles a week. And you know what I see in my coaching practice all the time? Runners who are 8, 9, 10 years into their running career, and they're still running 30 miles a week. There is no progression in their training. And it's a lack of mental toughness to recognize this is part of the process of training. We must abide by some level of progression. And when we recognize that mileage is probably the thing that contributes most to our performances, of course, if we're injury prone, we should add more cross training. But generally speaking, over the course of years, our peak mileage and our average training mileage should generally tick up a little bit year to year. And so that's a really great example of strategically pushing yourself in a way that is very long term. And one of the things that I want to impress on anybody listening is, like we said earlier, this isn't beating your chest and trying harder and some of these fake examples of toughness or machismo. This is really a long term, patient. I'm doing what's in my best interest, even if it's not necessarily what I want to be doing right now. And that's really the entire concept of mental toughness for me.
Yeah, and when you talk about even progression in mileage, or I think like lack of periodization, right? Where someone is running for, decades and they are still at that 30-mile a week mark, but that's literally what they're doing 12 months out of the year, right? And they're not, I guess, mentally tough enough to have the variety in their training and to maybe get outside their comfort zone, or train in a different way for a certain training block, right? Or season of their running journey. And you talk about injuries, Jason, you probably don't know this, but for the first time in my, if you remember, I was like an adult onset runner. So I didn't run in high school like you did. I actually couldn't run for like 42 days this past summer because I actually tore my plantar fascia. And you describing like being mentally tough, and I've worked with many injured runners obviously, but going through that process myself and being able to, someone who literally never cycles, no, someone who never runs on the treadmill, to try like body weight supported, to be doing as much cross training as I did and workouts on the bike just to work, those different aerobic zones. And uh, yeah, that was mentally tough, honestly. So I could definitely relate to that from like the injury standpoint. But then also I would just highlight, where you're talking about injuries, because there are many people listening to this right now that are probably battling like a nagging injury, and, being mentally tough to stick to your program, maybe that your coach has outlined or your PT has outlined, and make sure you're consistent with these specific exercises that you're doing, right? Like all of that feeds into this mental toughness that you're talking about. And most people probably don't think that's being mentally tough, but is really important in the bigger picture in growing in our running journey. So I love that.
Exactly. I mean, after all, it's this long-term patient commitment to the process. Sometimes that's the process of getting really fast. Sometimes in a certain season of your running career, it might be building mileage and volume. Sometimes it might be treating an injury or trying to get stronger so that you can reduce your injury risk. So there's a lot of different goals that we can have. Just to name a couple other quick mental toughness mistakes or examples where we're seeing a lack of mental toughness. Another big one that I see in my coaching practice is rarely racing. And we'll probably get into how to build mental toughness. From my perspective as a former collegiate runner and now a coach. For me, you can't build mental toughness in a vacuum. You have to build it out in the real world. You're never going to learn mental toughness on a podcast listening to me and you, Duane. Sorry, that's never going to happen. You can learn kind of how to do it and then go do it out in the real world. And that's really what we're talking about. And you actually have to expose yourself to the things in which you will need mental toughness to overcome. And probably the best example of that are races where you're asking the utmost of your body, you're putting yourself on the line and really doing the most intense thing that runners can do. And, I see runners who might only race once a year. And, racing is another skill, just like mental toughness. And if you're not practicing that skill, you're not really learning, the nuances and shades of gray and ins and outs of racing. So a parallel to that is also never really doing any hard workouts. And that's another constant that I see in my coaching practice. Someone will go 6 months without doing any kind of faster running. And if you never expose yourself to discomfort, whether it's high mileage, hard workouts, racing, things like that, it's really hard to build mental toughness.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. So before we get into the how to, sell me on, some of these strategies we're going to talk about in the how to, like what are the benefits, right? When you work on these with your runners, what are the benefits of implementing these psychological tools to improve like mental resilience in runners?
I mean, we could probably do an audiobook on the benefits of mental toughness and really why someone would be interested in working on this mindset skill. But was it Babe Ruth who said baseball is 90 or 50, 90% physical and the other half is mental or something like that? I'm totally butchering that.
I'm not sure. I
Yeah.
should know that, being a longtime Yankee fan.
Yeah. There's some quote like that, but the gist of it is that the mental side of the sport is bigger than you think. And I would say one of the things that I worked on the most as a collegiate runner was my mindset. And that was probably the biggest shift that I had to endure going from high school to college, because you're basically going from an amateur high school scene. Every person who competes at the college level is basically treated like a professional runner, except you're just not as fast. So it's the best education on training and being in that world, even if you're not competing at the levels of a professional runner. And you learn how to do almost everything. I mean, you learn how to be committed. You learn how to think patiently and long term rather than just, I want to run fast this season. Well, that's nice, but I really care about the regional meet 11 months from now. So, how do I get there? How do I think in terms of an annual cycle? Um, every college runner is going to get hurt. And so they're going to have to deal with injuries, and they're going to have a very good support team around them. And so it's a great education because you're not really allowed to slack off. You are pushed to treat your problem like a professional, to be process oriented. And so if you build this skill of mental toughness, you are going to learn the skill of consistency. You're going to learn the skill of accepting diversity and learning how to control the controllables, but be very accepting of what you can't control. You're going to get really good at being gritty. At the end of a workout, when you're struggling, you're going to learn how to push past that. And you're also just going to learn, because of this commitment to the process, you're going to learn some of the finer details of when to push, when to maintain, and when to quit. And I really want to push back on this idea that always, quitting is always bad. Quitting is not always bad. Sometimes quitting is a very, very good idea for your long-term health. Because, if you don't quit, you could have a very serious injury. And I don't see that as a mentally tough decision. Why suffer through the final stages of a workout or a race to not feel good, to have a finished performance that is not very impressive to you? And then, of course, you might be dealing with a pretty serious injury at the end. So the skill of mental toughness, I think, helps you on a very day-to-day basis. Oh, I got to get up at 5 in the morning for my run. Well, okay, I'm mentally tough. I'm committed. And it helps you with this very medium and long-term approach where, I believe in my abilities. I have the self-efficacy to know I can execute a training cycle, but I also know what to do over a long-term period. And I'm okay taking that 12-month, 18-month perspective on things because I understand building endurance is a long-term game.
Yeah. So what I heard there is, you're getting more confident, self-efficacy. You're more motivated to be able to hit your goals and stay on task. It sounds like that you're kind of eye is on the prize, right? Like, what your goals are, so you're focusing on those goals. I love that. And what are some of the common mistakes runners make when trying to build this mental fitness?
I think the biggest one is is not doing the training, because I think of all the ways to build mental toughness, like it's like 80% training. You have to actually put yourself in the position to have to learn mental toughness, because if you never actually have to learn it, if you're never forced to learn it, you probably won't. You're never going to become mentally tough reading a sports psychology book or listening to a podcast like this. You actually have to take what you've learned here, sort of like training. You actually have to go do the training. You can't get fit by ingesting information. You actually have to go do it. Same thing with mental toughness. It's not about trying harder. It's not about, a little bit of extra willpower in your brain. It's about, okay, if I'm committed to training, now I'm going to train consistently. So I'm going to get up every day, no matter what the weather is like, no matter if I have to get up at 5 in the morning or I have to go running at 8 p.m. I'm going to sign up for races. I'm going to put myself in a position to suffer a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a good thing. I think if you're a mentally tough athlete, you are less likely to experience the pre-race anxiety of newer or beginner runners who don't race very frequently, and they end up putting races on a pedestal, like, oh my god, this big thing I'm going to do. And I only race 2 or 3 times a year. I mean, there were weeks where I would run 3 or 4 races in a single week. And so at a certain point, you just like, hey, it's just another race. You stop taking it so seriously, and I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want to put so much of your mental energy into the pressure and expectations of any race. Now, of course, have big goals, shoot your shot. Nothing to take away from that. But if the point is, if you never race, it's a situation that is going to be kind of new on goal race day. And every coach says don't try anything new on race day. Well, if you only race twice a year, the race is something new on race day. You're not even
Right,
used to
right.
that. And then, like I mentioned before, a corollary to that is not really doing consistent workouts so that you're not exposing yourself to that kind of difficulty. But I think a simple mistake that could be corrected, that is sort of more psychological, is just being your own worst critic and giving yourself a lot of criticism. I want folks to be their own best cheerleader, because if you can't be your own best cheerleader, who can be? I mean, of course, maybe your partner, you've got training partners who are going to really help you along with, some of the difficult moments of training. But if you're constantly succumbing to that little devil on your shoulder who's telling you you're tired, you should stop, you should stay in bed, it's really warm here, it's cold outside, don't go running. That's a really tough place to be, because you're basically dealing with an internet troll, but it's you all the time. Nobody
Right.
wants that. So those are some of the big things that I see. And if we can just avoid some of that, like, let's get the training right so they were actually kind of in the environment in which you can learn mental toughness. And then from there, let's not be so hard on ourselves. Let's be more positive. Again, mental toughness is a positive skill. And, from there, we can go on and learn a lot.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is the biggest mistake that you are feeling is this almost mental toughness detraining, right? That someone's not giving themselves enough opportunities to actually pull these tools out of their toolbox throughout their weekly training or on race day because they're not racing enough. So you have to just, yeah, I tell, I'm sure you tell all your athletes, it's kind of like, yeah, when we're building up for this half marathon or this marathon, those long runs building up, like we are actually starting to use these like skills of building mental toughness that you're going to need to pull out on race day, and making sure that they are aware that, yeah, you know what, let's say someone's doing a long run workout and it's a quality day for them, that, yeah, this is where you are going to practice that. And there are times I know in my personal journey where I didn't race for, a while, or, it has been a long time. And I reached a hard workout and was like, it caught me flat footed. And I was like, wow, why does this feel so freaking hard? Why do I feel flat? Why? And it was like, oh, that's right. I actually have to prepare for this type of workout. I can't just go outside and think, I'm going to start running and then whatever, my coach has planned, it's going to like, my watch is going to beep and my legs are going to go at that pace and it's going to feel at that, let's say we're doing threshold 7 out of 10 effort. It was like, why is this feeling like an 8 or a 9? No, I didn't actually mentally prepare beforehand. I wasn't thinking about how this is going to feel beforehand. And I wasn't ready to actually, implement some of the strategies during the workout. So I can certainly relate to that. And I think that is a great point that you bring up, that we almost get like this detraining if we think, hey, I'm going to just be mentally tough for that goal race of mine that I have in 4 months, that I have in 6 months. It's just going to happen on race day because, like you said, right, I'm going to will it to happen and I'm just going to try harder in that race and I'm going to dig deeper for that race. So, yeah, I love, because I don't think most people would think of that as a mistake, but I agree that it is very, very common.
Yeah, and I think the word detraining is probably perfect to describe what can happen if you don't practice this mental skill pretty regularly. Like there's a reason why we call the first race of any season a rust buster. You need a rust buster at the beginning of the season to kind of shock the body a little bit, but also shock the mind. And I think your description of doing a hard workout and kind of not being psychologically ready for that hard workout is just a good example of the fact that when you are really consistent with good training, and I think any runner can really identify with this, when you're running a good amount and you're being consistent with long runs and you've done a whole bunch of hard workouts and maybe you've had a few tune up races, yes, you are physically fit, but I also want you to recognize the mental fitness that you have built through that journey because they go hand in hand. You can't be physically fit without also having a commensurate level of mental fitness. And mental fitness is only built through the trial of miles and the training process and journey. So, I want every runner who is ever in really good shape to remember the fact that yeah, they could just go attack workouts and races weren't so anxiety producing for them. And so it's just a great place to be. And so it really highlights the fact that if you want mental toughness, it is a marriage between the body and the mind. Okay, on the training side, yes. First, let's be consistent. Let's make sure that we're doing hard workouts. We're doing consistent long runs. We're committing to the process and scheduling races. But then on the psychological side of things, let's really be aware of our self talk. Let's make sure that we're trying to stay positive and not talk ourselves out of actually enjoying the whole process of training and really focus on what's going well. I think this is another key. I do believe in a little bit of personal gaslighting. I like to lie to myself a little bit. When I walk out the door and it's 13 degrees out, I'm like, "Ooh, this is going to be a good run." And I'm sort of lying to myself a little bit. And I think there's a real value to, telling yourself a little bit of a story. There's nothing wrong with that. I have a training journal, the performance training journal, and we have a section in it where I want you to give yourself a compliment. It's basically like self kudos, like on Strava, except you're giving kudos to yourself. Write in what went well, what you're proud of, what you're excited about for this run. And then after, a week or two or a training cycle, you're gearing up for a race, you can go back in your training log and read in your own words all the things that you're excited about, that you're proud of, that went really well. And that is such a source of confidence. So there's a lot of things that we do in training, and that sort of sets the stage. But then there's also these things that we can do psychologically that really help nurture and enhance these psychological skills.
Yeah, those positive affirmations do help shape the brain and doing them consistently. And I love that you created the performance journal because I've taken to journaling, these past 3 years and have found it, helpful from a life standpoint, business standpoint, but then training standpoint, right? And I love that you've created something for runners to focus on that training and doing the act of reflection and being able to give those positive affirmations. So you are making changes in your brain, and it goes a long way as far as like training and performance. And there is a ton of research in that area. So I love that you have created that resource for runners. Healthy runners, I truly hope that you are getting value from my conversation with Jason because I know I got a ton of value from it that I'm going to utilize for my next marathon during training and during the race itself. And he was nice enough to actually offer you something special for being here for this training. Have you struggled with negative self talk or the proper focus to lock in during a race? Or maybe you've had too much of that nervous energy before the race and started too fast, or you've never been able to reach your big goals, stick to a training plan, or stay healthy. Now, imagine if you could build mental toughness that creates unshakable confidence for your next running goal. With Mindset Mastery, you will learn how to eliminate anxiety, fear, and doubts to feel confident to crush your next running goal. You know how important having the right mindset is. Heck, it is why I included it as one of the 6 steps to growing in your running journey. And runners with high levels of mental toughness stay mentally strong despite distraction, imperfect race conditions, inconvenience, and discomfort. If you're ready to discover what you could accomplish with higher levels of mental fitness, I'm excited to offer Jason's Mindset Mastery course to you with a healthy 25% off savings for our Healthy Runner community. All you need to do is use code Healthy Runner at checkout. Simply go to strengthrunning.com/mindset mastery, or just click the link in the show notes. Now let's get back to my conversation with Jason Fitzgerald. Let's kind of pivot a little bit, if you will, to okay, how do we actually, right? Like, how can we build this mental toughness and training that you speak of?
Yeah. So once we've sort of set the scene with our training, so okay, we're going to do these hard things. I really think that's like 60% of the journey here is just regular, repeated exposure to difficult things. And if you're committed to the process, you're going to fail a lot. There's going to be a lot of trial and error with a highlight on the errors. And even though that's going to be true, you're gradually over time going to become a very mentally tough runner if you only do that. And so, that's sort of like baseline, that those are table stakes. Let's actually do good training. But then there comes just a few mindset shifts that I think are really important that, I think I learned just by osmosis through running on a team with old guys that were older than me, who were more experienced, who could sort of, share a little bit of wisdom. But also, I've had more than 10 coaches at the high school and collegiate level. And that itself was a tremendous education, not just in like, ooh, what workouts to do, but really in how to think about running. And that, I think, is the hardest part of this whole thing is what kind of mindset do you have about the sport? And I think anyone who's coming to the sport later in life has to recognize that running is a sport that is different from team sports or ball sports, in that there's a lot of adversity. I was a basketball player before I was a runner. I never suffered in basketball. It was always fun, for the most part. Of course, I didn't like some of the drills, or, I got to play with that guy on my team, things like
Right.
that. But there wasn't suffering, there wasn't adversity. And I think the mindset shift that has to happen first is I must accept that sometimes running is going to suck, and that's okay. Like, let's bring myself back to positive thoughts. And again, this sort of practicing this art of extreme acceptance. Yeah, I'm going to run 7 days a week. That seems crazy, but I'm committed to doing that. And that's just a mindset shift. Or I know this workout's going to be difficult. I'm just going to accept that. And there's some really interesting studies that show if you go into any task with the expectation it's going to be easy, you really start freaking out when it gets hard. But if you go into that task understanding that it's going to be difficult, you're much more able and willing to navigate that difficulty if you know about it ahead of time. I don't want to go into a workout thinking it's going to be an easy run, because I'm gonna be like, oh my god, I wasn't ready for this, and like I didn't have enough caffeine, or whatever it might be.
Right.
And we've got to sort of accept ahead of time that this might be uncomfortable, and that's okay. And if we sort of have to separate what we're doing with how we're feeling sometimes. Now, how we're feeling is one of the best inputs that runners can have, but often it's not a good thing to obsessively focus on how we're feeling, because how we're feeling might not be good. We've all heard of the rule of thirds, where a third of your runs might go great, a third are mediocre, and a third aren't good at all. And if 2/3 of your training sessions are either mediocre or they're not going to go very well, you've got to be really good at sort of ignoring some of those feelings and just executing what you need to do. Again, focus on the process instead of kind of wallowing in this feeling of, oh, I don't feel perfect today, so I'm not going to do the workout, or I'm going to do something different, or I'm going to run less, or I'm going to run slower. It's like, well, again, there's a time and a place for that if something's actually wrong. But for the most part, we can grind our way through a lot of workouts. And it's just this, number one, acceptance of the difficulty, trying to stay positive, and sometimes ignoring how we're feeling because, after all, how we're feeling is sometimes very uncorrelated with what we're capable of doing. And a great example of that I'm sure a lot of runners understand is you show up to a race, you don't actually feel good, you're worried about how you felt during your warm up, then you go and you actually run really well. If you had listened to how you were feeling in the warm up, oh, maybe I'm going to be more conservative with my race approach, on and on ad nauseum. But I like to sometimes forget about how I'm feeling because sometimes it's just not accurate.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I was definitely thinking back to like the workout I mentioned where I wasn't ready for it. I was caught flat footed. And like you said, you really have to go into that approaching, yes, this is going to feel difficult. It is going to feel hard. And, think about what it feels like to hold a certain pace, right? At that pace. And how does that feel on your body? I think that's important, going into it. And you mentioned earlier about like racing a 5K, and I know you've preached this for years on your podcast that I've heard, and I took your advice after kind of going down like a marathon, journey, and I'm still on that journey. Last spring, I really periodized my training where it was kind of like, okay, I'm going to do like 5K training, race in the spring and do a 5K. I raced my first 5K in like 4 years, Jason. And that was like, man, I got like smacked in the face, right? Like I was like, holy crap. I forgot how hard it is to race a 5K. And I didn't perform as good as I thought I would, right? But I did have, another one on the calendar 3 weeks later. That one I performed much better because I put myself in that discomfort that you're talking about and had to use some mental tools to prepare for that. So I definitely am thinking back to you kind of talked about like, wiping the rust off for those races. That can be super helpful. And, going to some like more specific examples that many runners might face if they feel like, how do I shut that little voice in my head off when it just wants me to slow down or give up? Like, what do you say to that? How can we work on that or become more mentally tough when that happens?
Yeah, it's a really good question because if you just started running or if you're an Olympian, we all have that negative voice in our head telling us all manner of negative things that we simply don't want. It's like, oh my God, did my enemy just get in my head to sabotage me? What is happening right now? I think the best way to navigate that is to drown that voice out with a more positive voice. And here is where we can get into really specific sports psych skills of mantras or personal affirmations. And what I will say to that is we could sit here and I can give you a half dozen mantras. One of mine in high school was grimace. And that's partly because we stole a cardboard cutout of Grimace from McDonald's. I'm pretty sure the statute of limitations has run out on that one. It was after a team dinner. And so for my entire cross country season, we had this like 6 foot tall Grimace cardboard cutout in the locker room. And we would chant Grimace before a race because one, it was funny, but also we knew it was going to be hard. We were going to be grimacing in these races. And it was a recognition that we were going into battle. And that I love that. And what I want to express is it must mean something to you. So grimace probably doesn't mean anything to you. It probably sounds silly and it's not going to work. You can use personal affirmations like, how bad do I want it? In the past, I've used the mantra of trust your training, because if you've done training well, racing is just a logical extension of the training. If you've done the training, you are ready to race. And so if you trust your training, you're going to be in a good spot. In longer races, when I ran my PR at the Philadelphia Marathon, for the first 20 miles, I was just telling myself to relax. relax, relax. This is easy. I was gaslighting myself a little bit. This is a fun run. Look at you're jogging around Philly. This is so fun. No big deal. Look how low your heart rate is. Just relax. I was just gaslighting myself in perpetuity during the first 20 miles. You can say, I start strong and finish stronger, or I'm the best prepared here. All of these mantras, either words or phrases that give you strength, that distract you from some of the negative thoughts that might be coming into your head, are all really important. So, I think that's really helpful during the event, whether it's a workout, a long run, or a race, the moments where you need a little bit of extra, psychological positivity, fall back on one of these mantras, but just make sure that it really means something to you. Because if it doesn't, it's just not really going to work. And the other thing that I would say is you've got to practice it. So use it during workouts so that when you use it in a race, it's powerful. Because if you just kind of remember, oh, I have this mantra I thought about 3 weeks ago, and you've got 1,200 meters left in the 5K, I'm not sure if it's really going to be very powerful for you. So let's make sure we're using it in training so that you can get the most value out of it on race day. And then finally, I'd say, the other more specific sports psych tool is visualization or imagery. And the way that I like to use visualization is to kind of imagine in your mind the workout or the race or the long run or whatever you kind of need help with from a mental toughness perspective, and try to, especially this is okay if it's a shorter race, very hard if you're doing this for a marathon, but try to run the race in your head. And I don't mean, go through a 5K in 5 minutes in your head. If you're going to run a 25-minute 5K, take 25 minutes to imagine every step, foot, and meter of that race, and imagine how you're going to be feeling. And the key to effective imagery is, number one, you've got to use all your senses. So don't just imagine what you're going to be seeing. How are you going to be feeling? What are you going to smell? Are you going to be taking any gels? What's that going to taste like? What's the texture going to be like in your mouth? And then also, let's practice imagining how we are going to respond to adversity. So don't visualize the perfect race, because that's like, what, 10% of the time that happens? I look back in my career, I've got like 5 races that went perfectly that I have on this pedestal. That was like, I ran 25 years so that I could have 5 perfect races I will never forget in my life. But most of them don't go very well. So you sort of have to imagine some of the adversity that you're going to experience and how you're going to respond to it, navigate through it. So you miss a gel in a marathon. What are you going to do? Or you go out a little bit too fast in a 5K and you hit the half mile split and you're like, oh my God, I'm flying. My heart rate is beating out of my chest. I need to calm down. Okay, slow down, get yourself psychologically calm, try to lower your heart rate, but do that during a session of visualization before you're trying to do it in a race situation. So these skills of using, I wouldn't call them skills, they're more tools like imagery or personal affirmations or mantras. These are things that have to be personal to you. They have to be practiced ahead of time. But even though they sound a little bit woo woo, and I'm sort of like the no nonsense guy that doesn't love this kind of stuff, but I have seen its power. And if someone is struggling with a plateau, or they have a lot of anxiety around their training, or they're just going after a really scary, ambitious goal, now's the time to start practicing some of these things, because you might surprise yourself with how mentally strong you get and how effective you are at executing on workout or race day.
Yeah, though there's so much goodness there, and I've had Chris McClung on the show before, and we kind of did a whole episode on mantras. And yeah, his thoughts are the same as yours in terms of like direct techniques that we can use and pull out on race day, but we also have to practice them in training. And I love what you mentioned about making sure that it resonates with you, that these have to be personal and we just can't steal people's mantras. And the practicing in training is that time that you guys get a chance to, did it really help when I felt like I was getting a little flat. And you know what? The sun came out and it was getting hot toward the end of my workout. And I was trying to hold my pace and it was getting hard to do that. And I pulled out this mantra, like, did it actually work for you? If it didn't, right, then we need to go back to the drawing board, right, and see, okay, what will resonate with you. And then if it works, then it's like, okay, this has worked. Maybe you journal about it, right, and say, hey, this is the mantra I used during this workout. It got me through these tough times that I was having in training. Hey, let's put this one aside, and let's plan on using this on race day. And then the other thing that I love that you mentioned was, I know kind of Chris called these like the rhythm mantras. Like, what are you going to tell yourself that's going to kind of calm you down when your heart rate starts spiking earlier in a race or midway through the race or at whatever point, and you know that you need to conserve as much energy as possible so you have that kick at the end of the race. What are you going to tell yourself? Because if you start, trying to pump yourself up, that's not going to help, right? So like, what are you going to tell yourself to kind of stay calm? And I think most runners, depending upon what their training looks like and when they can pull out those kind of fight mantras, if you will. The rhythm mantras, like, everyone can use help in that area, and everyone can pretty much practice those almost on a daily basis. When you are going out there a little too fast for your easy run because you were rushing and you were trying to get out of the house and you were getting the kids here and you have a meeting in like an hour and you only have like 40 minutes to get your run in, right? Like, you're already revved up, your heart rate's already like elevated before you even take your first step. So now you've started running and now you're running too fast and you're like, well, I got to work out tomorrow. My coach is going to kill me. I know I should be keeping this easy, right? Like, what are you going to tell yourself to keep yourself calm? And like, we have an opportunity to practice those like almost every day, or like every runner can pretty much practice those on probably every long run for the first 2 or 3 miles, to make
Yep.
sure that you are, keeping that heart rate low in the beginning of the run. So much goodness there. And I think those can go a long, long way, guys. If, yeah, like, Jason, mentioned it might seem woo woo, but like, I practiced this stuff myself, for the first time in, the last 2 or 3 years, and this stuff works. And I've had many athletes that have practiced it. And if you haven't implemented any of what Jason's talking about, I would highly recommend it. And you talked about kind of being nervous before a race, before. I had a huge bout I shared on the show before during my second marathon attempt. And it's funny how you mentioned about like not racing, not putting yourself in those situations. I did leave a good 5 years in between my first marathon to my second, because the first one, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I cramped up mile 20, all the rookie mistakes, didn't fuel enough, didn't use electrolytes, all that stuff. So I had a good 5 years, but by the time I went for that second, helping, if you will, of the marathon, I had so much pre-race anxiety beforehand because I did all the hard training and I was ready to like kill this race. And, I had all this pre-anxiety, beforehand. And I know there are many runners who get really nervous before races. Like, you mentioned before about, I think that was when you were kind of talking about a little bit of journaling, but is there any other like mental strategies that we can utilize to stop feeling so nervous like before a race?
Yeah, that's really good point too, because I think this is one of the things that really trips up a lot of runners. This feeling of pre-race anxiety. Um, I think step number one is recognizing that it's normal, and in fact, it's a good thing to have some anxiety before a race. And if you can, number one, accept it, be like, okay, the best runners in the world are all nervous on the starting line. They're about to do something that hurts. So every human is nervous for that. Elite runners are not superhumans. They are not aliens. They feel anxiety just like you and I do. So that's step number one. Um, I think it's also really important to kind of set the stage before you line up on race day. And so here is where let's race frequently. Not too frequently. We need to be judicious with things, but let's not go incredible periods of time without racing. Let's do the training so that the race is a logical extension of the training itself. So it sounds like you did that yourself. I think too, part of this feeling of anxiety is the pressure we put upon ourselves to perform at a certain level. I don't actually think there's anything wrong with having expectations for yourself, even high expectations. and feeling anxious because you're not sure if you can, run the PR or, have a good second marathon in your case, Duane. I very much felt that too during my second marathon because same exact story. My first marathon didn't go very well. It took me 3 more years to run a marathon, and I put a lot of expectations on myself. And so, first I recognize that, okay, part of this anxiety is normal. Number two, I'm going to reframe it as excitement. My kids probably felt the exact same physiological response when we were walking to the monorail to go into Disney World. And they weren't like, oh, I don't want to do this, I'm anxious. No, they were jumping out of their shoes because they were so excited. So reframe it as excitement. This is going to be awesome. Oh my God, my body is tingling and I'm just so I'm excited to do this. So there's that. And then, of course, like right before the race, this is where we get into some of those more specific strategies. So here's where a good personal affirmation or a good mantra is going to be helpful. I think certain breathing patterns or strategies can be helpful. I think there's the physiological sigh has been getting some press recently, which is we basically take 2 big breaths in a row and then a long exhale. And if you do that 3 or 4 times, it's been shown to actually reduce levels of anxiety and sort of lower your heart rate. So I think that's a really good strategy. Learning some of these specific sports psych skills. So you might be on the starting line, 5 minutes to go, and you're visualizing the first mile. I think here is where it's a good thing to be a little bit disassociated from what you're doing. If you're dwelling on what you're doing, you're worrying about how the final mile of a marathon is going to feel. Hey, let's cross that bridge when we get there. We're not there yet. Let's, and now we can talk about, we're going to segment the race. We're going to chunk it up. We're going to only focus on the mile that we're in, and again, be process oriented to our race execution as well. So that's sort of a laundry list of strategies. There's no one strategy. And I think it's also really helpful to recognize too that your pre-race anxiety might be solved with a mantra, or it might be solved with better training beforehand. And so that just gives you a lot of confidence. Or you might be someone who just, you do a couple breathing exercises and you're like, oh man, I feel amazing. I don't feel like I don't want to do this anymore. So all we really can do is present athletes with a menu of options because everyone is different. And I really think we are more psychologically different than we are physiologically different. When we talk about treating an injury or training theory, we are way more similar than we are different. But when it comes to our minds, I think there's a little bit more variability. So here's where experimentation is really important. Let's find what works for us. Let's use a whole bunch of strategies in training so that we're not just leveled with pre-race anxiety on race day. We've been preparing for this both physically and mentally ahead of time for months.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of themes here that there are these kind of tools or strategies, and they can be helpful for multiple purposes, whether or not you're shutting that little voice off in your head, or you're nervous before a race, or you just want to kind of go for it right at a race, and maybe you're feeling scared. You can take whether it is visualization, imagery, mantras, but I'm hearing this common theme of we have to practice these in training and challenge ourselves within training, maybe do a little bit more races than we feel comfortable with, journal, reflect on your training, right? And really implement this as kind of part of that training. So as we come down kind of the final stretch here, if you could change one thing about the misconception about mental toughness, what would that be?
I think it's what we talked about earlier, this idea that mental toughness is willpower, grinding your way through things, beating your chest, being loud, very publicly tough. That's not really what I'm interested in when it comes to mental toughness. And if you look at some of the more mentally tough runners out there, they're not engaging in that kind of behavior. They are very consistent. They do the hard workouts. They almost treat training like it's their profession. of course, a pro runner is their job is running. But, like I said earlier, if anyone has run in college, you kind of know that you sort of treat running like a part-time job when you're in college. And that exposure, that perspective on things, I think is probably the best education you can get on mindset training for runners. So, if you want to build this skill, be process oriented. Really think about what is the best thing for me to do today. Can I find a good training plan? Can I execute on it as best as I can? Can I be committed? Can I be process oriented? If you do those things, you're going to do really great at building mental toughness. And I think it starts with the training, and then you need to learn the specific skills that tools that you can then bring to the training.
And you mentioned that process term multiple times today, and I'm just shaking my head in silence every time you do, because I think that is a huge, huge thing that most runners can probably spend their time a little bit more wisely, is focusing on those process goals or habit goals as opposed to the outcome and how a specific run felt. Like you used that example, which I thought was a great example. On the majority of runs throughout the week aren't feeling glamorous, right? You're not getting that runner's high, and realizing that, recognizing that, and really focusing on the process itself of training, rather than the outcome or how fast you're running, is definitely a theme that I've sensed here today. So thank you for bringing that up, and just kind of bringing this full circle for everyone. Just kind of recapping, right? Like what Jason's talking about here in terms of being a more mentally tough or resilient runner. We talked about like what that mental toughness actually is, and hopefully it was a little eye-opening to you, and maybe your perception of what mentally, being a tough runner was. We talked about, when is it that we have a lack of mental toughness, or what are some like examples of when it kind of shows up? We talked about the benefits and having more confidence, and being able to kind of complete training and really not having anxiety, right? Not being worried, not being scared before races, or to tackle hard workouts, do hard things in your training. We talked about the common mistakes that runners make, and we talked about really within training of how do we build that up. We gave some specific examples of whether it was the pre-race anxiety and feeling like nervous before races, or just not being able to give up, when that small voice in our head is chirping. Yeah, Jason, this has been super informative. It's been really fun to catch up with you. As the saying goes, the third time's the charm. Where can runners learn more about either mental toughness or all the fabulous things that you offer for the running community?
Yeah, runners can go to strengthrunning.com. That's my home base. You can find our training programs, the Strength Running blog, more information on the Strength Running podcast. So if you really like podcasts, that's a good one for you to check out. There's also the Strength Running YouTube channel. So if you prefer video, a little more bite-sized pieces of information rather than long-form podcasts, that's a really good place to go. And then specifically, if you want to learn about, training your brain and really understanding some of these psychological skills and mindset training, we do have a course that you can access at strengthrunning.com/brain. I think it's really important, like I mentioned before, to train your brain as a muscle, just like your quads and your hamstrings and everything else, because it's really going to help power your training and help you stay consistent and committed, and really help you execute on what you know you need to do.
Guys, this stuff works. Clearly, Jason knows what he's talking about. This has been great. Thank you so much, Jason, for sharing with our community. Yeah, Jason Fitzgerald from Strength Running. I will have all the links within the show notes. And thank you, runner, for listening to this, whether you're listening on the podcast or you are watching on the Spark Healthy Runner YouTube channel. I appreciate you. And if this episode about mental toughness was helpful, And you will definitely, surely like the chat Jason and I had about strength training as power training. So if you're listening on the podcast, just queue up 171 on the Healthy Runner podcast. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then just click the video that I have for you next. As always, let's continue to grow a strong mind, a strong body, and just keep running. Until next time.